Okay, so I'm making this video because in the wake of the killing of Charlie Kirk, I am witness to the same thing you are, which is the world is on fire, at least the Western world is on fire, with some of the most divisive topics that it has absolutely not been able to integrate or make sense of. Topics that Charlie Kirk had really strong opinions on, debated extensively, topics that are probably flooding through your social media just like they are with mine, and yeah, all in a way that is illuminating how profoundly divided human beings are around politics, issues to do with race, gender, and so on. And something that I'm observing as I witness this is I feel like humanity in the modern West is desperately trying to have certain conversations about these topics that we just don't know how to have. And I want to make this video because I feel like there are ways to have these conversations which can allow them to happen, which can allow them to be functional conversations, but they require certain frameworks and the capacity to work within those frameworks in order to have those conversations constructively, in order to have those conversations in a way that doesn't just fracture into polarization, or at least massively reduces the possibility of that. So I want to actually go into some of these areas which I feel like are some of the most intractable domains of collective culture right now, and look at them through some of the lenses that, to me, I have found most helpful in my sense making of what is going on with the world. I don't for a moment imagine that everyone has to use the same models that I do, although I do think the models that I look at the world through really help. And yeah, I know lots of other people look at the world through those models as well, or through comparable ones, or through their own ones, which, you know, perhaps also have real benefits. So I want to name my kind of biasing perspectives before I go any further, and the models that I'm going to be looking at some of these major issues through. One which I'm going to spend a lot of focus on in this video is to do with integral theory, Ken Wilber's integral theory, which is really a kind of a theory of everything. It's based on the idea that no one individual or group is wrong all of the time, and there are ways for us to be able to put the different perspectives and positions that different individuals or groups have had into a coherent whole in a way that makes sense of it, where all the different parts fit in and can be complementary. That's all I'll say about integral theory for now. I'll go into some further pieces around it later. I'm also heavily influenced by the Trans-Malayan teachings, and also other spiritual traditions, Buddhism, the radical awakening traditions of the East broadly. I would also say I have a deep sense of connection to Christianity and to the transmission of radical love of Christ, and yeah, and also to indigenous traditions across the world. So I'm going to dive right in, and yeah, and this is an offering, and it's an offering to attempt to contribute to a process of us human beings finding better ways and frameworks to be able to have the conversations about the most divisive issues of our time in a way that is integrative, non-polarized, constructive, generative, rather than draining, separative, fractured, and all the things that we're seeing. So I want to just start with the current political climate, and particularly focused on what's going on in the USA with the rise of Trump and the current MAGA movement, and where the Democrats are in the political left and the political right, and so on. So I think a really helpful way to understand the rise of Donald Trump is spelled out in Ken Wilber's small, very readable book. I think it's called Trump and the post-truth world. I might have got that a little bit wrong, but it's the rise of Trump in the post-truth world, or Trump in the post-truth world. And basically what Wilber outlines there is he works with a major piece of his integral theory, and that piece is based on an integration, a cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary integration of a huge amount of research around development. And that's both individual development and collective development. Development in the domain of cognitive or developmental psychology, and then also more in the kind of anthropological domain, which studies the development of collectives and perspectives around social evolution as well. And there's many different facets that are really helpful in that part of integral theory, but the piece that I want to focus on most at the moment is what Wilber calls structural development. And structural development is to do with the development of collective, in one particular domain, it's to do with collective worldviews that seem to pervade cultures or nations, societies, collectives, right? And that there's a process of development that happens over time, over really large periods of time. We're talking about the whole span of human history here, where there have been the emergence of collective worldviews that have had collectives see the world and understand events through increasing levels of complexity. And those increasing levels of complexity are increasing capacities to take perspective. Now, if I just give some examples of these, the three which are probably most relevant to our consideration are what we could call the traditional structure, which integral theory would say emerged around 10,000 years ago with the agrarian revolution. The modernist structure, which emerged around the time of the Renaissance. And the postmodern structure, which, let's say, emerged around the 60s or so, 1960s. Now, it's really important to talk about these three structures, these three collective altitudes, we could say, because essentially all the wars and conflict, the culture wars that are happening today, are being fought between human beings who are inhabiting these different worldviews. I'm going to say that again. That is a really important point. The vehement, divisive, vitriolic, venomous culture wars that are being fought today are being fought between human beings inhabiting these different worldviews, and are maintained by their complete inability to be able to understand each other's perspectives, to see the world through each other's perspectives, to understand each other's languages, and to understand each other's values, because worldviews are expressive of collective value trends, I guess you could say. So if we look at those through the traditional, the modernist, and the postmodernist, broadly speaking, crudely speaking, and with all of this, we're talking about, I'm making, as Wilber says, orienting generalizations. So these are generalizations that may break down when we look at things through much higher levels of specificity. But there are levels, I'm convinced, and would definitely, stand for, that there are levels at broad scales where these things, to me, seem demonstrably true, right? So the traditional value structure that emerged around the time of the agrarian revolution around 10,000 years ago is a worldview that is characterized by absolute notions of right and wrong, that carry certainties of reward or punishment, and by an ethnocentric perspective that has a very strong sense of in-group, out-group. So absolute notions of right and wrong that carry certainties of reward and punishment, and very clear lines of demarcation between in-group and out-group. Sound familiar? Right? So we could say a lot of the Abrahamic religious traditions, seem to operate in that way. They have absolute notions of right and wrong. If you do this, you will always go to heaven. If you do this, you will always go to hell. You will be rewarded by God if you do this. You will be punished by God if you do that. And our group is the right group. Other groups are the wrong group. And that can have more healthy or, less destructive and more pathological forms. The less destructive forms of that are tolerant, like, okay, well, I think you're in the wrong group, you're subscribed to the wrong God. If you're a Muslim, you're a Buddhist, you're a Hindu, you're a Jew, whatever. Jews probably less so if we're using the Christian example. But if you're a subscriber to that other religion, it's the wrong one, but I can tolerate you, right? The pathological form of that is, I cannot tolerate you, I must destroy you, you must be killed, for whatever reason. And there are multiple examples of that, whether it's the Christian Crusades or whether it's the radical fundamentalist Islam. There are multiple examples of that that we could trace through history. But so those are characteristics of the traditional worldview. It often also plays out through very clear, it's rules and roles as well. Men have these roles, women have these roles. Various, a person's sense of identity and meaning in society is very much often determined by a sense of rules and roles. So then we have the modernist structure, which emerged around the time of the Renaissance, where there starts to be, this is the birth of the scientific worldview. This is the birth of rationalism. This is the birth, at least in the West, because there's evidence that Native American tribes, for instance, were operating at this level and this level plus way before those in the modern West were on a collective level. Check out the book, The Dawn of Everything, if you're interested in that. So yeah, in the modern West, at least, this is the birth of rationalism, empiricism, science, and it's where there started to be the separation of church and state, which was a hugely important thing in the evolutionary trajectory of Western civilization. No longer could the church persecute people with impunity who criticized the church or who, sometimes it still happened, of course, but there started to be a massive line of demarcation there. Yeah, people who were critical of the church or who didn't believe what, their view of God was. The example that's given sometimes is, instead of having a bunch of theologians theologizing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, the empirical scientific worldview was, well, let's actually just have a look, right? And then we have this explosion of empirically oriented scientific culture which starts to emerge, which radically changes the world over the next 100 years. And that still plays a major role in society today, and this structure, you could say, is the first, in integral theory, it's described as the first world-centric structure. So by that, it means it affords a sense of equal validity to all human beings, but it's not necessarily deeply compassionately embracing. It's basically like every human being has the right to social mobility, has the right to try and climb the ladder of social opportunity in society, and I'm going to do my best to win, because we're still in a survival of the fittest type of world, and yeah, it's based on competition, achievement. This is an explosion of business and so on, and da-da-da-da-da. And then we have the postmodernist worldview. And the postmodernist worldview emerging around the time of the 60s and it's spurred on by existentialist philosophers, spurred on by an increasing interest in academia, in the intelligentsia of society, to recognize the collective, contextual power structures that seem to be influencing people's experience, influencing people's perspective, influencing events in society. The postmodern structure came along and said, hey, wait a minute, actually all truth arises within broader contexts. All truth arises within cultural contexts, the bias perspectives, contexts that relate to imbalances of power, contexts that relate to systemic oppression, contexts that relate to systemic injustice. And that really matters, actually, because it has a critical influence on people's place in society, our sense of justice, our sense of equality or not. And yeah, that collective structure, and of course there's so many other facets of it, but because of its capacity to recognize, because of it having developed a level of cognitive complexity to be able to recognize and objectify collective contexts of the collective contextual imbalances of power or systemic injustice, which are the contexts within which a lot of events are happening, whether it's how racial segregation or the degree to which Black people or white people in society have equal levels of opportunity, and lots of other examples of that. It suddenly has a value, it values diversity in a way that previous structures just don't value diversity in the same way. And that valuation of diversity then becomes a great celebration of equality, and equality across diversity, and an interest to preserve and to actualize more diversity, and diversity as a marker of healthy systems and so on. Each of these structures has major blind spots and challenges, and each is massively present in the culture wars that exist in the world today. The traditional Christian right, as it's playing out in the MAGA movement in the US and more broadly across the world as well, has a very, very solid base in that traditional value structure. Remember, absolute notions of right and wrong that come with certainty of reward and punishment, and very clear lines of demarcation between in-group, which is the right group, and out-group, which is the wrong group. It also has a strong center of gravity within the modernist structure, which just wants to make a good wage, and has this kind of Protestant work ethic, science and tech plus vibe to it, and so on. Now, the political left is very much anchored in the postmodern structure, and also has some of this pro-business, pro-science, pro-tech dimension to it as well. But really, you could say that the most vitriolic and venomous culture war politically that's being fought in the modern West today is between the traditional and the postmodern value structure. And here's the thing, right? So these structures that I've named are what in integral theory is described as the three highest structures of first tier levels, of the first tier of developmental structures that collectives of human beings pass through. There are structures below these levels that involve tribes and clans and warlords and horticultural societies and so on, and that's actually a little bit more complex, like the degree to it. These ideas of social evolution and what constitutes higher and lower, as it were, it's much more complex. And I think integral theory actually has some significant blind spots there, which is a whole other conversation. But a critical characteristic of all first tier structures in integral theory, and this is a really, really helpful point to get, is all of them think that their worldview is the right worldview. All of them think that their worldview is the right worldview. Now, these structures are called first tier structures because there's also second tier structures, and integral theory would also describe third tier structures as well. But one of the things that characterizes post first tier structures is that they no longer perceive that their worldview is the only right worldview. Rather, second tier structures, which are called integral, which begin with what we would call an integral structure of development collectively, are the first structures to be able to recognize that all previous structures have their needed right place in the overall spiral of collective development. That actually all of us move through these structures, none of us avoids them, none of us skips them, all of us are developing through them, and healthy forms of all of them are critical to healthy human beings and healthy collectives. Now that is not perceived at the level of first tier structures, which, as I say, simply have the perspective that their structure is the right structure, and they have not developed perspectival, reflective awareness enough, we could say, to be able to objectify the other structures as critical stations on the evolutionary spiral that all collectives have the opportunity to move through. So, back to Wilber's book, Trump and the Post-Truth World, the point that Wilber makes in that book, which I think is so helpful in understanding the rise of Trump, is that the dominant center of power in Western civilization over the last decades had predominantly shifted to the modernist and postmodernist structures. Occasionally we'd have Republican governments, for instance, in the US, who would have a strong traditional base, but things like the emergence of the structures that have characterized the post-World War II era that have had this strong, interconnected globalization impulse have values that are deeply associated with the modernist and the postmodernist structures at their core. Free trade, an embrace of diversity, collective economic growth, internationalism. And the point that Wilber makes is, whilst those values and structures have been progressive from an evolutionary perspective, and that progressive for me there means that they are examples of evolution reaching into increasingly more complex and advanced terrain, they also have not provided solutions to many of the major issues of our society. And the rise of Trump is associated with those structures getting to a point where they just are recognized to not have the answers for major issues in collective society anymore. There are still, despite the liberal globalist project, there still have been massive issues around wealth inequality, poverty, educational lack of privilege, systemic injustice, massive swaths of human beings of various different communities within our societies just fundamentally left behind. Yeah, the globalist liberal project has not been able to provide answers to these problems. And in a sense, you could see, and what Wilber would say, the rise of Trump, or also populist, nationalist political movements, including Brexit, for instance, or the rise of the far right in France and Germany and all of these other examples, is a response to that. And actually the point that Wilber makes is a really, really helpful point, which is it's actually a response of the evolutionary process trying to correct itself. And here's what I mean by that. The postmodern structure, as it's played out through the main structures of power in Western civilization, in the US and the UK and Europe and so on, because it's a first-tier structure, it doesn't clearly recognize the importance and necessity of a healthy integration of the values of the previous structures within an overall healthy spiral of development, which means that the traditional values that in their healthy form expressed through a healthy ethnocentric identity, whether that's national, whether it's cultural, whether it's even racial, that is poo-pooed by those in the postmodern structure as racist, nationalist. Healthy versions of gender roles, for instance, or even just any recognition that there are differences between men and women in certain ways is recognized as a threat to equality by those operating out of the postmodern structure. Any recognition of differences around races in certain ways is actually just, or ethnicities better put, is perceived to be racist and a threat to racial equality and so on. So of course there are really unhealthy forms of recognizing and then devaluing, recognizing those differences and devaluing those who are perceived to be outgroup, which often are the case by people operating out of the traditional value structure. Charlie Kirk is one of them. You know, some of the videos circulating on social media of Charlie Kirk making, you know, saying things that it seems pretty clear that he's not just highlighting these distinctions, but he's then devaluing people who are in his perceived outgroup in ways that those on the political left find outrageous and, you know, just absolutely completely not okay. However, the rise of populist, nationalist political movements is a response to the lack of inclusion of the values which can be expressed in their healthy form of the traditional structure by the postmodern structure and the power structures and culture that are anchored in it. That's a really important point. The rise of populist political movements, Donald Trump, Brexit, I would even say, you know, people like Andrew Tate and their very high level of notoriety in society is because those individuals and those movements are advocating for and highlighting values which relate to the traditional, which relate to traditional values, albeit in healthy and very unhealthy forms, I would say, that we collectively can sense in some part of us have lost. Something's missing in the anchoring of so many of the norms and values of Western civilization purely in the modernist and postmodernist value structures. Something's been lost. And that then has a resurgence of, which is evolutionarily, the significance of it is our attempt to integrate that again in the rise of such movements and figures. Now, that doesn't mean that we should pass power automatically just back to those movements and figures. It doesn't mean that they finally now have all the answers, just like the other side didn't. And that's the war that we're in, right? That's the war that we're in, because I would actually say that what we're seeing now, and this is an edgy point to make, because describing any of this within the context of development is going to be highly divisive and controversial for anyone who doesn't have a developmental lens, is that what we're seeing is, in a sense, a regression. We're seeing, with the rise of Trump and the MAGA movement, we're seeing a regression from a world-centric, diversity-inclusive structure within the postmodern evolutionary structure to an ethnocentric traditional structure. And in a sense, evolution is trying to do a corrective move, we could say. Culture, our collective society is, whether it knows it or not, instinctually trying to do a corrective move, which is about the integration of the healthy forms of that traditional structure so that we can go forward together in a way that's healthier. Now, I'm talking at like a very high bird's eye level here in understanding all of these matters, and I or anybody else could equally spend hours naming many different, particular events and situations and occurrences that There are all sorts of other things going on, from examples of integral things happening and, from an integral altitude within the MAGA movement perhaps, or also incredibly ethnocentric and in-group, out-group stuff being demonstrated by those who are on the political left, which is absolutely true. There's a whole range of other occurrences which could be identified and named, and I'm talking about broad bird's eye view movements here. The thing that I want to get to is that if we're really wanting to get to a place where we can have the conversations that at the moment are dividing us so massively in ways that are integrative and constructive, then those conversations have to happen from an integral altitude. We have to have humans, collectives, conversations, and movements that push through to that next level of our collective developmental spiral, at which point we can start to identify essentially the DNA of the value structures underneath the perspectives that are being advocated for among the people who are at war with each other. That's a really important piece, to be able to identify the underlying value structures within a developmental context that are expressing themselves through the perspectives of the people who are at war with each other. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So, Charlie Kirk, when I tune into Charlie Kirk's surface level perspectives that are flooding social media right now in the wake of his utterly tragic and completely terrible death, what I perceive is a bunch of perspectives, some of which feel like they have some intelligence to them, some of which feel highly ethnocentric, feel very divisive, feel prejudicial, and even racist in certain instances. I have some sympathy for some of those perspectives, and a lot of them I find very difficult to be with. Now, I can either try and engage the dialogue on that level, or I can go to, can I actually sense into the value structures that are underneath those perspectives, and can I sense, are they healthy expressions of what I know must be included within the overall spiral of development from a traditional structure? Oh, actually, okay, what Charlie Kirk is talking about is he's talking about the necessity for us to be able to have conversations about differences, and differences that exist between things like men and women, or differences that exist between different cultures, or differences that exist between different nations, and or even differences sometimes that exist between people of different ethnicities. And what he's also advocating for, as often those on the political right are advocating for, is a place for the sacred and for a traditional relationship to the sacred within political discourse. Now, all of those things could express healthily or unhealthily, depending upon how they're engaged at the level of the perspectives that are being advocated for. But the underlying value structures, they are actually just part of the skeletal structure of the traditional structure, which has to be included within an overall healthy developmental spiral and arc, evolutionary arc for a collective. There's no way around that. We need laws for, if people kill people, then they go to jail, or if people rape people, then they go to jail, or things like this. These are examples of, yes, we need these within our society to maintain order and stability. And the healthy version of those traditional structures also contribute to that, and they contribute to there being healthy groups that can exist alongside other healthy groups, and those healthy groups having a sense of their own self-identity, having a sense of their own boundaries, which allows them a sense of internal cohesion and coherence to be able to then comfortably engage and build relationship with other collectives and groups. All of those are gifts of, if healthy, the traditional value structure. Now, if I'm a person on the political left who's taking Charlie Kirk's perspectives just simply at the level of the perspective, and those perspectives fundamentally violate so many of the values that I hold dear as someone who is operating out of the postmodern structure, then that all goes to shit. Because the only thing that I can hear is someone who is seemingly racist, sexist, xenophobic, and yeah, just spouting a bunch of toxic stuff that I think should be shut down, you know, even though I seem to be someone who stands for diversity and welcomes diversity as long as it doesn't disagree with my core values, which is the kind of performative contradiction of the postmodern structure and those on the political left. So the structure of the conversation that needs to happen for human beings to be able to begin to have integrative conversations about these hugely divisive issues of politics, race, culture, gender, geopolitical conflicts, and others, is for us to be able to have them within a context that is developmentally sensitive, that can tune into the value structures underneath perspectives that are shared, sense their place within the overall evolutionary spiral, do so from a perspective that recognizes the necessity of healthy forms at each level of the evolutionary spiral, and then is agentic in stewarding and supporting and inviting conversations and dialogue towards those healthy forms. Also, and validating the healthy forms and the necessity of the healthy forms of those perspectives, and also rightly addressing when there are unhealthy forms. So I think that's what I want to start with, and that's just naming a context around what's going on as far as political polarization today. There's all sorts of conversations that are really valuable to have around race, culture, gender as well. So maybe I'll do that in another video. Okay.